The cook stood on the cookhouse steps with flour drying on her hands, and she did not go down. Below her, a man in a black wool glove fitted a new lock to the laundry shack door, tugged it twice, and dropped the key into his coat. Behind him, three frozen shirts snapped on the line like flags for no country at all. A girl stood in the dirty snow and watched him do it, 17 years old, holding everything she owned. The ground over her mother's grave was still soft. Then the man crossed to her, and instead of money, he put a folded slip of paper into her hand and walked away without a word. The ground over her mother's grave was still soft when Orson Pyle nailed the company lock across the laundry shack door. Minta Dacey stood in the wet snow and watched the hasp go on crooked, watched him tug it twice to be sure it held. 4 days earlier, her mother had died coughing pink into a rag, her lungs gone soft from 6 winters of wringing other people's blankets in cold water that never once got warm. Now the door was shut, and the small iron key disappeared into the pocket of a man wearing a black wool glove. Minta owned 2 wool blankets, 1 canvas ground sheet, a hand axe, a draw knife, an awl, a cook pot, and $2.35. She had cornmeal, beans, coffee, and dried apples enough for 3 days if she ate like a bird. The nights had already dropped below 20 degrees. The bunkhouses did not take unattached women, and the man who had just locked her out was the same man who kept the store ledger where her mother's name still owed $11.80. She could not walk down the mountain. The winter freight team had rolled out the week before, and Pyle would not let her near a company mule. "You do not inherit wages from a debt," Pyle said, and handed her a slip of paper. She thought for one foolish second it might be money. It was her mother's account page. Coffee, lye soap, a wooden coffin at cost, 6 yards of muslin for a shroud. Every line subtracted, nothing added. He walked back toward the store without another word. Behind him, on the line where her mother had hung the crew's shirts to freeze dry in the sun, 3 frozen work shirts snapped in the wind like flags for no country at all. Minta did not cry. Crying used water and heat, and she had learned already that both were things you spent. She folded the account page into her coat and turned to face the camp that did not want her. The Sanger Lumber Company satellite camp sat on the raw edge of Converse Basin, and in November of 1904, it was a place built entirely for cutting trees and nothing else. Sawyers, teamsters, a cook, a timekeeper, and 40 men who came for wages and left when the snow made cutting impossible. There were no rooms for a girl. There was no charity budget. There was only the ledger, the saws, and the weather coming down off the high country like something with a grudge. Mabel Firth watched from the cookhouse steps, wiping flour from her hands on her apron, and did not come down. Minta understood why. Mabel had a 9-year-old daughter named Nell, and no husband, and she kept her place in the camp by keeping her mouth shut when Pyle held the ledger. A woman who crossed the timekeeper did not eat that winter. Minta did not blame her. She only marked it, the way she had learned to mark a draft coming through a wall seam, quietly and without argument, so she would know later where the cold got in. That afternoon, the foreman found her. Cyrus Wynn had cut timber in mountain camps for 27 winters, and he had the face of a man who had watched a great many people fail to survive things. He crouched at the edge of the canvas lean-to she had rigged against the locked shack, lifted the corner of it with one thick finger, and looked underneath at everything she owned. "1 wet canvas," Wynn said. 2 blankets. No stove. No roof timber. Less food than my saw crew eats before noon. He let the canvas drop. "You know what that is? That is a list of what a person dies with, not what they live on." "I know what I have," Minta said. "Then you know it is not enough." Wynn stood, and his knees cracked in the cold. He was not cruel. That was the thing that made him dangerous. He was correct. There is a feed shed by the mule barn. You can have it for one night. The mules need it back tomorrow. After that, girl, you are the company's problem, and the company solves problems by pretending they walked off on their own. He looked up the slope then, past the felled trees and the stumps standing like broken teeth, toward the high peaks where the cloud had thickened to the color of a bruise. Minta followed his eyes. Glass is dropping, Wind said. Wind's turning. That is not a squall building up there. That is the kind of thing that shuts a camp. He said it the way other men might mention the time. We close the exposed cutting ground tomorrow afternoon. After that, no man goes out past the Hall Road, and no one comes looking for anyone who does. He walked away. Minta stood in the snow and did the arithmetic that would run under everything she did for the next day and night. She had until tomorrow afternoon, not until spring, not until help came, until tomorrow afternoon when the last of the warmth and the last of the people would go inside and the mountain would take the rest. One night in a feed shed, then a storm, then whatever she had built or nothing. That was the whole of it. She spent the last hour of light doing the only thing that had ever calmed her, which was measuring the size of a problem. She walked the cut. She was not looking for shelter yet. She was looking for material, rejected slabs, broken poles, anything a girl with a hand axe could move alone. The company took the clean trunk wood and left the ruin, and there was a great deal of ruin. Giant sequoias did not fall like other trees. They came down with such weight that they shattered themselves, and the crews left the broken lengths where they lay because no mill wanted wood that had burst its own grain. That was how she found the stump. It stood at the western edge of the cut, past the Hall Road, on a piece of ground the survey lines had never quite settled. The tree it had been must have been enormous, even for that grove. What remained rose about 9 feet, a fat gray tower of a thing, wider across than a wagon was long. 15 feet, she guessed, from bark to bark, and on the downhill side, black against the pale wood, ran a vertical scar where fire had eaten into the tree decades before the saws ever reached it. A wound the tree had healed around and lived on past, wide enough at the base for a person to crawl through. Minta stood in front of the opening a long while. Then she got down on her knees in the snow, put her candle stub in her teeth, struck a match with hands already going numb, and crawled inside. The inside was not what the outside promised. From the clearing, the stump looked cavernous, a room a person could stand up in and turn around. But the fire had only hollowed the heartwood, and the bark and the living rings that had grown over the burn were thick, thicker than any wall she had ever seen. The true chamber inside was small, 7 feet across at the floor maybe, a little more at the shoulder. She could sit. She could lie down curled. She could not stand. Above her, the whole crown of the stump was open to the sky. Snow drifted down through it and settled on her sleeves. Minta lit the candle and held it up. Along the walls, where the cracks ran through the old wood, the flame barely moved. It stood nearly straight, only trembling the way a candle does in a still room. She moved it low, along the seams near the floor. Steady. She moved it to the base of the black scar, a small lean, no more. Then she raised it toward the open top, and the flame bent hard sideways, guttering, nearly torn out. She sat with that for a moment, the cold coming up through her knees, and her mother's voice came up out of some drawer in her memory where she had folded it away. A cracked wall in the laundry shack, a candle just like this one held against the gap, the flame laid flat. Cold comes through holes faster than it comes through boards. Her mother had pressed wool into the seam, and the flame had stood up straight, and Minta had been small enough to think it was a trick. She looked at the steady flame at the walls, and the torn flame at the open top, and she understood a thing that she could not yet put into words, but that she would spend the next day proving. The walls were not the problem. The walls were already better than anything in the camp. The problem was the hole in the roof. She crawled back out into the dark and the falling snow, and for the first time since her mother had stopped breathing, she felt something other than the cold. It was not hope exactly. It was closer to the feeling of picking up a tool that fit your hand. She found Win at the mule barn in the morning and asked him what a cabin would cost. He laughed, but not unkindly, and answered her as if she were a green worker who needed to learn how the world weighed. A plain cabin, 8 foot by 10, the smallest thing a man could winter in, would take more than 600 board feet of usable lumber, a stove and pipe, 20 pounds of nails at the least, and labor, several men for a full day, or one worker who did not know what she was doing for many days. "And you," Wynne said, "have got until this afternoon. You have got $2, a hand axe, and no stove. You do the sum. I already did it. It does not come out." "I'm not building a cabin," Minta said. Wynne's face changed then, and she saw the thing she would come to know well, the way a practical man's patience curdled when someone would not accept a true thing he had told them. "Girl," he said, "I have hauled men out of collapsed cuts. I have seen what a roof does when it decides to come down. You do not have the wood, you do not have the time, and you do not have the sense to know it. The stump on the west side, the burned one, it already has walls." He knew the stump. Every man in the camp knew it, and she watched him picture it, and she watched him arrive at the exact wrong conclusion, which was that a hole in the ground with a roof of snow was a place where a person went to freeze in comfort. "That stump," Wynne said, "will bury you standing up." He said it slow, so it would stay with her. "You will crawl in there to get out of the wind, and the roof you scrape together will take on snow, and it will come down in the night, and we will find you in the spring when the drift melts, still sitting up, because there was not room to fall over." She said nothing. He had given her the sentence that would follow her all the way to the end, and she folded it away with the account page in her mother's voice. 3 things now that she carried against the cold. She did not need a cabin. That was the whole of the idea, and it came to her not as a flash, but as a slow settling, the way silt settles in still water. A cabin was 4 walls a man built so he could stand up inside and work and cook and live. She did not need to stand up. She did not need to cook a feast or entertain a soul. She needed a space large enough to sit, to sleep curled, to keep a little food and water from freezing, and to hold the small heat a body threw off through a night. A cabin asked you to build 4 walls. The stump had already given her walls thicker than anything in the camp, thicker than the bunkhouse boards, where she had felt the wind push through the seams like a hand. She had watched 3 heat traps that morning and evening, and understood each one. The bunkhouse leaked through its long board joints, and the wind walked straight through the sleeping men. The cookhouse stayed warm, but only while the stove ate wood, and the moment the fire died, the cold came back like a tide. And the stump held a candle flame nearly upright against every wall and only tore it at the open crown. The advantage of the stump was not warmth. There was no magic in it, no matter what men would say later. The advantage was that the wind could not get through it. On every side but the top, the wind simply stopped. So she would close the top. Not with a roof for a room, a small roof, only over the 7-foot inner opening, low, so the space it covered was no bigger than a large closet. She would raise a floor off the wet ground so the damp could not climb into her blankets. She would bend the entrance so the wind could not blow straight in at her. And she would make the whole thing small on purpose, because a small space warmed and a large one only swallowed heat and gave nothing back. She scratched the plan onto a pine slab with the point of the awl, a raised sleeping platform, short poles across the inner gap, bark sheets and canvas over the poles to shed the meltwater, dry duff packed on top of the canvas, snow banked over all of it, but only after the roof had carried a test load, never before. A crawl entrance turned at an angle. 2 blanket curtains hung a few feet apart, a low opening beside the door to let air in, and a high opening near the roof line to let it out. She was still bent over the slab when Mabel Firth found her at the stump, cutting the rotten char out of the cavity with a draw knife. Mabel did not laugh. That was the difference between Mabel and the rest of them, and it was why her words cut deeper. "The wood sweats," Mabel said. She'd come out from the cookhouse with her sleeves still pushed up. "You put a warm body in a cold hollow, and the walls weep. Your blankets will drink it up. Then you will be lying in wet wool in the cold, and wet wool does not warm, it kills. I have seen it. You will freeze in bedding too heavy to lift." "I am raising the floor," Minta said, and showed her the line she had marked at ankle height in the shallow channel she meant to cut so the damp ran downhill and out the door. Mabel looked at it, and Minta could see her taking it seriously, which was worse than mockery. "That may help," Mabel admitted. Then she said the thing that had no answer. "And the candle? A flame eats air. You seal that hole up tight the way you are talking, and light a candle in it, and lie down to sleep. You may not wake. I have a girl who is 9 years old. Come sleep in the corner of my cookhouse. It is against the rules, and it is crowded, and it is not warm, but you will breathe." Minta opened her mouth and closed it. She had no answer. She had thought and thought about the wind and the walls and the wet, and she had not thought about the air. She stood there with the draw knife in her split hand and understood that the woman who was trying to save her had just found the flaw that could kill her. It did not feel like a victory. It felt like a door she had not known was open, letting the cold in. "I do not have an answer for that yet," Minta said. Mabel nodded slowly. She had expected the girl to argue, and the not arguing changed something in her face. "Then think of one," she said, "before you close that roof over your own head." And she went back to her kitchen. Minta looked at her plan scratched on the slab and, for the first time, wrote a question mark beside the word air. She had 2 problems now instead of 1, and by noon she had a third, and his name was Orson Pyle. He came up the slope from the store with 2 laborers behind him, and he did not crawl into the stump or crouch to look at her plan. He stood at the entrance where he could look down at her and told her to stop. "This tree lies inside company timber limits," Pyle said. "You will not cut it, carve it, or alter it." "It is broken," Minta said. "It burst when it fell. No mill wants it." "That is not your concern." His breath smoked in the cold air. He held the ledger under his arm, the way another man might hold a weapon. His stated reason was safety. The stump was a hazard. A girl could be hurt. The company would not have it. But Minta had grown up in a camp, and she had learned young to hear the difference between a man's stated reason and his true one. Pyle had already promised sections of giant sequoia wood to a merchant down in Fresno, novelty slabs cut from a famous grove, the kind of thing men bought to prove they had been somewhere large. She was standing in the middle of his money. I worked the laundry beside my mother for 6 weeks, Minta said. That is wages owed. Pay me those, and I will trouble you for nothing else. There is no separate entry under your name. Then enter it. You do not inherit wages from a debt, Pyle said, the same words as the day before, worn smooth from use. He tapped the ledger. Your mother owed this store. The burial came out of it. There is nothing left, and there is certainly nothing for you. He turned to go, then turned back, because he was a man who liked the last word to land. That stump will be split for slab by the end of the week. If you have crawled inside it, I suggest you crawl back out. That evening, at the long tables in the cookhouse, he made it public. He waited until the room was full and the men were eating, and he stood and announced that any man who lent the girl a tool would pay for its replacement out of his own wages. He said it plainly, over the clatter of tin plates, and the room went quiet the way a room does when men are deciding whether to be ashamed. Then one of the sawyers, a big man named Deffenbaugh with sawdust still in his beard, called down the table. Here the queens took a castle up the west cut, he said, Queen of the Stump. And the shame broke into laughter, because laughter was easier, and the name went around the tables and stuck. Queen of the Stump, living like a queen up there in her hollow tree. A younger sawyer picked it up and ran further with it. Someone ought to carry her firewood up. Can't have Her Majesty splitting her own kindling. More laughter. A third man said the tree would make a fine coffin, saved the company the price of boards, and that one did not get a laugh, because even in a room of tired men there was a line, and he had walked past it. The room shifted, but no one told him he was wrong. Minta stood at the door with the tin plate Mabel had risked slipping her, and she let the laughter go over her. It was only sound. Sound did not build a roof or seal a vent, but she counted them. Deffenbaugh, loudest. The young one who wanted her firewood carried. The coffin man, 2 others who laughed with their eyes down, ashamed and laughing anyway, which she understood to be the most dangerous kind because they would not help her and would not admit why. She marked each one the way she marked a draft, so she would know later where the cold came in. What struck her hardest was not the men who laughed. It was the ones who did not. A dozen of them ate in silence and looked at their plates, and she knew every one of them could see the arithmetic as plainly as Wynne could, and not one of them believed she would live the week. Their silence was a kind of grave already dug. She would rather have had the laughing. Cyrus Wynne did not laugh. He set down his fork and spoke into the quiet after, and what he said was worse than laughter because it was true. I will not back Pyle's debt talk, Wynne said. The girl is owed wages, and everyone at this table knows it. Pyle's face darkened, but Wynne was not finished. But I will back stopping her. I have pulled men out from under fallen roofs. Thick walls do not matter one damn when the roof comes down on you. She has no timber and no time and no business up there, and helping her build it is helping her dig a hole she will not climb out of. Minta crossed the room then, past the staring men, and set her pine slab on the table in front of Wynne, the plan scratched on it in all point. Show me the weakest span, she said. You have pulled men out of collapses. Then you know what fails. Show me the one that would fail here, and I will fix it. The whole table watched. Wynne looked at the slab for a long moment. Whatever else he was a man who could not look at a drawing without reading it, and she saw him reading it against his will. He put one thick finger on the line of poles crossing the inner gap. There, he said, straight poles across a span. They carry the load each on their own. Snow builds, one of them cracks, and the crack does not stay in one pole. The load it was holding drops onto its neighbor, and now that one carries too much, and it goes, and they all follow, quick as a row of matches. He pushed the slab back at her. That is where it kills you. That is where it killed a man I knew in a mine at Cerro Gordo, and he had better timber than you will ever cut. Then I will not run them straight. You do not know how to run them any other way. Knowing the pole will break is not the same as knowing what to put in its place. That is a lifetime, girl. You have got a night. Then teach me the one thing, not a lifetime, the one span. For a moment, she would remember this. Something moved behind the old foreman's eyes. Some old habit of a man who had once been young and had once been taught. Then he put it away. He had pulled too many people out from under too many roofs to help a child build one over her own head, and he had decided that watching her fail was kinder than helping her die. No, Wynne said, and picked his fork back up. I am not going to teach a child how to build the thing that buries her. He ate. Around him, the table found other things to talk about, and the space where Minta stood became a space no one looked at, which was its own kind of answer. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been dismissed by someone who had authority, but had not taken the time to understand what you were building? Mabel caught her outside in the dark, snow sifting down between them, and offered the corner of the cookhouse one more time. One night by the stove, warm, dry, breathing. Minta almost took it. Her feet had gone numb hours before, and her split palms burned in the cold, and every reasonable voice in the camp and in her own head said the same thing Wynne and Mabel and Pyle all said, which was that this was a grave, and she was digging it. But if she went to the stove tonight, she surrendered the stump. Pyle would have it split for slab in the morning while she slept warm, and then there would be no walls anywhere in the world that were hers, and the next storm would find her in a corner she could be thrown out of. The warm night was a trap the size of one night. The stump was a gamble the size of a winter. Thank you, Minta said, but if I leave it tonight, it is gone. And she walked back up the west, cut alone, past the hall road, to the broken tower of gray wood with the black wound in its side, and she began to build in the dark with a candle stub and a hand axe, because there was no more time to wait for morning. She started with the floor, because a wet floor was the thing Mabel had made her afraid of, and fear was a good foreman. She crawled in and set the candle stub in a notch of the wall where the draft could not reach it, and she worked in the small yellow light on her knees because there was no room to do anything standing. The draw knife bit into the punky char, and it came away in wet black handfuls, cold as grave dirt and smelling of old smoke and rot. Under it was the sound stuff, and under that the leaf mold, and she dug down through the black damp with the hand axe turned sideways for a hoe until the blade rang faint against packed mineral soil. That was the bottom she wanted, not the sweating dark stuff that held water like a sponge, but the hard cold floor beneath it, which would stay put and would not weep up into her blankets in the night. She hauled the spoil out on the ground sheet, dragging it through the crawl mouth and dumping it into the snow, load after load, until she had a black ring of it around the entrance, and her arms had gone past aching into a dull, steady burn she stopped feeling. She stopped once to breathe and looked at what she had. A round pit of firm ground the size of a small table, ringed by walls 2 feet thick. Above it, the dark. She could not think about the roof yet. She made herself do the next thing that had an answer, and the next thing was water. She scored a narrow channel from the low side of the pit out through the base of the fire scar, downhill, following the fall of the land so that any water that came up through the soil or ran down the inside of the wall would find the trench and leave rather than pool beneath her bed. She had no gravel. She went down to the creek in the dark, breaking through the skin of ice at the edge, and pried fist-sized stones loose with the axe head until her fingers would not close, then carried them up in the fold of her coat and laid them in the trench and packed bark scraps between them so the stones would not silt over. She did not know a name for the thing she was making. Down in the camps, they might have called it a rubble drain, if they called it anything at all. She knew only that water ran downhill, and that she wanted it to run away from her instead of toward her, and stone by stone she made the ground agree. Then the bed, because a body that sleeps on cold ground gives its heat to the ground and gets nothing back. She cut 2 sill poles from a sound fall in length, notched them flat on top with the hand axe, and set them across the pit to raise a frame a hand's width off the soil. Across the sills she laid bark slabs split from the shattered sequoia, and here the tree helped her, because giant sequoia bark came away in long, fibrous sheets, red-brown and tough as horsehair matting, the same skin that had let the living tree stand through fire after fire. She thought, splitting it, that a tree whose hide peeled off in blankets like this had learned a thing or two about keeping warm, and that she would be a fool not to learn it from a dead one. On the bark slabs she piled dry fir boughs, springy and deep, and over the boughs she folded one of her 2 wool blankets. That was the bed, raised off the damp, drained beneath, layered against the cold rising from below. She pressed a hand into it, and it did not sink to wet. She had solved one of Mabel's 3 problems, and she let herself feel that for exactly as long as it took to feel it. And then she looked up again at the open dark where the roof was not, and the feeling went out like a pinched wick. She had not solved the roof, and she had not solved the air, and the light was long gone, and her candle stub was down to a thumbnail. Her hands were the worst of it. The drawn knife and the axe had opened the skin of both palms, and the cold had cracked it further, and every load she hauled reopened the splits until she was leaving small dark prints on the pale bark. She cut 2 strips from the hem of her mother's apron. She had kept the apron, could not have said why, and wound them round her palms and kept working, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant the arithmetic, and the arithmetic still did not come out. She had perhaps 16 hours before the camp closed the cutting ground. She had a floor and no roof. She had a windproof wall and a plan that might suffocate her in her sleep. She had a foreman who would not teach her the one thing he knew would kill her, a timekeeper who meant to split her walls for souvenirs, and a whole camp that had a name for her now and used it laughing. She was kneeling in the entrance, winding the last of the apron strip round her right hand with her teeth, when she heard boots in the snow behind her. She went still. It would be Pyle, she thought, come to make good on the splitting, or one of the laughing sawyers sent to run her off. She turned in the low mouth of the stump with the hand axe already in her wrapped fist. A man stood at the edge of the clearing in the falling snow, an old man hunched against the cold, and he was not carrying a lantern or a bottle or an order from the company. He was carrying a carpenter's square. "Put the axe down," the old man said. "If I meant to run you off, I would have brought men, not a square." Minta did not put the axe down. She had learned that much. "Then what did you bring it for?" "To find out if you had used one." He came forward into the light of her candle stub, slow, and she saw that he was old, 60 and more, and that the 2 smallest fingers of his left hand were bent and would not straighten. An old crushing, the kind a man got between a timber and a thing that did not move. He crouched at the mouth of the stump and looked past her at the pit and the raised bed and the little drain running out beneath the fire scar. And he did not say any of the things the others had said. He said, "Why do your roof poles run straight across?" She had sketched them that way on the slab. Straight was simple. Straight was what she knew how to cut. "Because straight is easier," she said, and heard how thin it sounded even as she said it. "Easy to cut is not the same as willing to carry." He said it without heat, the way a man states the weight of a thing. A straight pole carries alone. It is proud. And a proud thing under snow breaks alone, and then its load falls on the next proud thing. And you learn tonight from Wynne how that ends because I heard him tell you. He looked at her. You marked the cavity at 3 heights. You cut out the rotten poles and threw them in the snow instead of hiding them under the roof where they would not show. That is why I climbed up here in the dark. Not because I pity you, because you measured. His name was Lucian Harrow. He had built flumes for the water companies and cribbed the shafts of hard rock mines before his hand went bad. And he knew the 2 things that mattered most to her that night, which were how a load travels and how fast a mountain can change its mind. He would not swing an axe, the hand would not let him hold it safe, but he would mark every pole, and he would teach her, and she would cut. That was the bargain, unspoken and understood inside the first minute. He was not there to save her. He was there because she had earned looking at. He taught her the first thing with a tin cup and 4 twigs. He set 2 twigs across the mouth of the cup and pressed down in the middle with 1 finger. They bowed apart and fell in. Straight, he said. Then he took 4 twigs and bound them at the crossings with a bit of thread from his coat into a shallow woven lattice, a raft of sticks, and laid that across the cup and pressed. The lattice sank a little and stopped. His finger could not push it through. Woven, he said. Now every stick shares. Press on 1 and 4 answer. The load runs out to the rim of the cup, to your walls, instead of down through the middle onto your face. They chose 6 poles that night, and the next morning, sound fir between 4 and 5 inches through, each long enough to span the 7-foot inner gap with a good foot of bearing at either end. And here Lucien was hard as iron on 1 point and would not bend. Every load-bearing end had to rest on solid stump wood, on the pale living rings, never on the black crumbling char. Charcoal will hold a bird, he said. It will not hold winter. Bed your poles on wood that was alive. She cut where he marked. He marked where his eye told him the wood was true, sighting down each pole for the twist and the weak grain, rejecting 3 for every one he kept. Smaller poles wove across the 6, lashed at every crossing. By the middle of the morning, the roof lattice sat over the inner opening like the top of a basket, and when Lucien leaned his whole weight on it, it took him and did not complain. That was 20 hours before the camp would close the cutting ground. She let herself believe for a moment that 20 hours was enough. Then it began to go wrong, the way it does. Mabel Firth came up the west cut in the gray forenoon carrying a bundle under her arm, and she did not pretend it was anything but what it was. Burlap, she said, and dropped it by the entrance. Off the potato sacks. It is filthy and it will not win any prizes, but layered under a blanket it holds a good deal of a body's heat. She looked at the roof lattice and the drain and the old man marking a pole, and Minta watched her recalculate, watched the certainty of a dead girl move over into something less certain, and it plainly troubled her. I still think this thing may kill you, Mabel said. The air. You have not answered me on the air. I am coming to the air, Minta said. Doubt is not permission to let you freeze. Mabel wiped her hands on her apron the way she did when she had decided something and did not want to be talked out of it. That is all. Do not thank me. And she went back down to her kitchen and her ledgers and her daughter, and it was the first help that had come to Minta without a price stapled to it, and she folded that away too in the drawer where she kept her mother's voice. It was near noon when the roof failed. Pyle came up to see the splitting he had promised the merchant, and found instead a roof where he had expected ruin, and it made him careless with his anger. He put his boot on the outer edge of the lattice where it overhung the stump wall and leaned his weight on it and said, loud so the 2 laborers behind him would hear, that the whole thing was a child's basket and would not carry a hatful of snow. and an undersized cross pole she had not yet replaced cracked under his heel, and the roof dropped 6 inches on that side, and dry duff and bark shook down into the chamber. Pyle laughed. "There," he said, "there is your winter. It came in November, and it weighed as much as one man's boot." Lucien did not raise his voice. He never did. She would learn. He climbed up beside the dropped edge and looked at where the pole had gone and said, to Minta and not to Pyle, "He has done you a kindness he did not mean. His boot on that overhang is near enough the weight a foot of wet snow will put right there. You would rather learn it now at noon with the sun up than at midnight with the storm on you." He looked at the timekeeper then, mild. "You have tested her roof for her, Mr. Pyle. It failed exactly where a careful builder would want it to fail. Early, thank you." Pyle had no answer for a man who thanked him for breaking a thing, and he went away, and that was its own small victory, though it cost her a pole and an hour. She replaced the cracked pole with a heavier one, added 2 braces crossing under the lattice, and lashed every joint with strips of wet rawhide. Lucien showed her how to cut. "Green hide shrinks as it dries," he said. "You lash it wet and loose, and by morning it has pulled itself tight as an iron band, and it does not rust, and it does not cost you a nail." Her palms had split again under the apron wrappings. She wound them tighter and did not stop. Then Lucien answered Mabel's question, the one that had no answer, and he answered it with the same candle that had started everything. He turned Minta's cook-pot upside down over the flame, leaving a gap at the rim, and the candle burned on for a moment, and then began to fail, the flame shrinking, going sooty. "There is your sealed shelter," he said. "It is not the cold that stops the fire. It is that a flame eats the same air you do, and in a tight box you both starve together, and you do not feel it happen. Men have died in snug little dugouts warm as toast, and been found without a mark on them." He tipped the pot to open the rim wider, and the flame stood up and cleared. 2 breaths, low and high. Cold air's heavy, so it comes in low. Bad air's warm, so it leaves high. You give the shelter a mouth and a nose, and you never... He looked at her until she was looking back. You never stop both at once. She bored 2 openings that afternoon. A low intake beside the sheltered turn of the doorway, no bigger than her fist, where the cold, clean air would settle in. A high exhaust through an existing split near the roofline, capped against the snow, where the used air would climb out. She cut sliding wooden covers for both so she could throttle them in the worst wind, and Lucien took the covers from her and notched a stop into each with his knife, so that neither could ever slide fully shut. "Your hand gets cold at 3 in the morning," he said, "and it wants to close every hole in the world. This stop is there to argue with your cold hand. Let it win." He made her say the rule back to him. Never stop both breaths. She said it. He made her say it again. The candle, he told her, went out before sleep. Always. It could light her supper and warm her hands for an hour of waking, and that was the whole of its work. It was not the thing that would keep her alive. She understood, and some part of her mourned it a little, because a flame in the dark had come to mean her mother, and now it was only a tool with a rule attached. The entrance was the last teaching, and the one that gave her the first proof that was hers alone. A straight doorway, Lucien said, was a barrel of a gun pointed at her bed. Wind would find it and fire straight down the bore. So they built a short crawl tunnel of slab offcuts and poles that turned once, a dog leg, before it reached the chamber, and hung one wool blanket at the outer turn, and a second at the inner mouth a few feet apart, so that between them was a small dead pocket of still air that no gust could cross in a straight line. When it was done, she doubted it. So she tested it the way she tested everything, which was by making it prove itself. She scattered a handful of cold wood ash across the floor by the sleeping platform, and had Lucian go outside and shake the exterior canvas and beat on the tunnel mouth with his good hand, hard, the way a wind would. She crouched by the ash and watched. It stirred, a grain or two, at the very edge. The rest of it lay where it had fallen, undisturbed, in the middle of a storm she had made herself. She sat back on her heels and looked at the still ash, and for the first time she knew, in her hands and not just in her head, that the thing worked. Not that it might, that it did. The first snow came at dusk, dry and fine, and she laid the roof up in its order, bark sheets, then the canvas, then dry forest duff shaken over the canvas, and then only then a first shallow skin of snow no more than a few inches. She did not bury it. Every voice in the camp expected her to pile 3 feet of earth on it and be done, and that, Lucian said, was how you found out your roof was weak, all at once, in the dark, with the weight already on you. Listen instead, he said. He put her ear against the heaviest pole. A pole that is going to fail warns you first. Little cracks, small as a mouse in a wall. Ticking. When you hear it change its tune, you take weight off, not on. So they added the snow in stages, and after each stage Minta sat inside and struck the main pole once with the bowl of a spoon and listened to the note it gave back, and Lucian and Mabel banked more snow above, and she listened again. The note stayed clear and low. At roughly 18 inches of packed snow over the whole small roof they stopped, because the note had begun, just barely, to tighten, and a tightening note was a pole telling her it had taken what it could hold and would like no more. 18 inches of snow was not weight for its own sake. It was a blanket. Snow held still air in 1,000 tiny rooms, and still air did not carry heat away. And so the same snow that would have crushed a straight pole roof now sat on her woven one and kept her warm. She understood the joke of it and did not laugh. The thing that killed the men in the bunkhouse was going to be the thing that saved her, and the only difference was the shape of 6 poles. Pyle made his last attempt with paper. He came at mid-afternoon with an order in his hand, requiring Minta to vacate company timberland, signed and stamped, and he read it out in front of the men who had gathered to watch the girl fail. But Cyrus Wynne took the paper from him and read it slower, and Wynne knew the ground better than any survey, and he saw what Pyle in his hurry had not. "This describes the cutting tract," Wynne said, "east of the Hall Road." He looked up the slope, past the road to where the stump stood. "That stump is west of the road, on ground the survey never closed. It is a doubtful line, Pyle, and I am not going to send a man up a mountain in falling weather to enforce a doubtful line and maybe start an argument the company has to pay a lawyer to finish." He handed the paper back. "Come spring, take it to Sanger and let them sort the boundary. Tonight I have a camp to close." Pyle folded his order and put it away, and the look he gave Minta was not anger anymore. It was the look of a man doing sums of a different kind, and she understood that she had won time and only time, not the stump, not her wages, a night. She spent the last 2 hours of light stalking it. 2 water jugs wrapped in burlap against the bed, 3 days of food, the lantern, and 6 candles, to be spent one at a time. A shovel and the long clearing pole Lucien pressed on her in case a vent choked. Dry socks in a tin with a lid, the axe by the entrance, and a cord. This above all, run from the inner curtain, out through the tunnel, to a marker post. She drove into the snow in the open so that a person caught blind in blowing snow could find the door by feel alone. Lucien would not stay. He went down to the mill bunkhouse before full dark, and at the tunnel mouth he stopped and told her the truest thing anyone had said to her in that camp. "It has passed a load test," he said. "It has not passed a storm. Those are different animals. Watch your breaths and mind your roof, and do not be brave. Brave is for people who did not build careful. He touched the frame of the door with his ruined hand. You built careful. Then he was gone into the blue dark, and she crawled inside her small, warm cave, alone, and pulled the second curtain across behind her, and for a while there was only the candle and the sound of her own breath. Then the high vent began to whistle. She lay still and listened to it. A thin high note through the roof line split, and did not know at first whether it was the sound of a shelter breathing right or a shelter about to be torn apart. She held a match up to the vent. The flame leaned toward it, steady and sure. Air was moving out, the way Lucian said it should. The whistle was the wind passing the cap, nothing more. She let her breath go, but she marked it, the note of it, so she would know later if it changed. She measured, because measuring was how she kept the fear in its place. She had brought her mother's small mercury thermometer, and she hung it by the bed. Outside at dusk, it stood at about 18 degrees. Inside the closed stump, before she had done anything at all, it read 26, why, 8 degrees the walls had given her for free, only by stopping the wind. She lit one candle and sat with the door curtains closed for the space of a waking hour, eating cold beans, and when she looked again, the glass by the bed read 35. Not warm. She wanted to be honest with herself about that, because a lie about warmth was the kind of lie that killed. 35 was not a parlor, but it was above freezing. Her water would not turn to ice. Her fingers worked, and she had made that with the small heat of one body and one candle in a space no bigger than a closet, which no stove in the camp could have done without eating a cord of wood a night. The candle's part in it was small. She could feel that it was small, a hand's breadth of warmth near the flame and little past it. The real gift was the smallness of the room and the deadness of the air. She wiped a sleeve along the lower wall, and it came away wet. The walls were beginning to sweat, exactly as Mabel had warned, so she slid the high vent open another notch, and the glass by the bed dropped 2 degrees down to 33. But the wall began to dry. There it was, laid bare. Every bit of warmth she kept made the air wetter, and every bit of dry air she let in cost her warmth. She could not have both all the way. She could only tend the line between them all night, awake, like a fire that was made of no fire at all. Someone came at full dark, and it was not Pyle. Warren Pike, a teamster, was making the mule line fast against the coming wind, and he stopped at her tunnel and asked, gruff and half-mocking, whether Her Majesty would object to a man taking a reading in her castle. She let him crawl in with his own thermometer, and he sat hunched in her doorway for a quarter-hour, saying nothing, watching his glass. He had come to prove it read the same as outside. When he crawled out, he did not say a word to her, but she heard him later at the bunkhouse, telling Win flat that the girl's hole was better than 20 degrees warmer than the yard, and that he did not understand it, and did not much like not understanding it. But there it was. He did not praise her. That was what made men believe him. Then the storm stopped pretending. The wet flakes turned to something else, fine hard crystals driven flat, no longer falling but flying, and the whistle at her vent climbed a note, and the temperature on her glass began to drop faster than it had any right to. The wind came around to the northwest and hit the camp on its weak side. She pinched out the candle, as Lucian had made her swear she would, and lay in the full dark with the thermometer she could no longer read, and listened. Somewhere down the slope, a whole sheet of bunkhouse roofing tore loose with a sound like a long roll of thunder that did not stop, and then something heavy struck the top of her stump and stayed. The chamber went stuffy first. That was how it announced itself. Not cold, but close. A thickness in the air, and a small, dull ache starting behind her eyes. She struck a match and held it to the high vent, and the flame that should have leaned toward the outlet barely moved. Whatever had landed on the roof was sitting over her exhaust. She did not panic because Lucian had made panic pointless by giving her a tool. She took the long clearing pole he had insisted she store inside and worked its end up through the service slit at the vent and thrust eating once, twice, and on the third, a wedge of packed snow and a torn strip of tar paper blown from some ruined roof and pasted flat over her cap slid away and fell outside. The match flame jumped and leaned hard toward the vent. Air moved. The thickness in the chamber thinned, and the ache behind her eyes let go, and she understood with a cold clarity that the thing which had nearly killed her was not the storm. It was her own good work. She had sealed the shelter so well that one block breath could have finished her in her sleep, and the only reason it had not was two openings and a rule and a rod within reach. Never stop both breaths. She said it aloud to the dark and cleared the vent again for good measure. Outside, the numbers turned brutal. The true air fell to about 6 degrees below zero. The gusts came near 55 miles an hour off the northwest, and against skin that meant something like 40 degrees below. Not because the air itself grew colder than 6 below, but because that much wind strips the heat off a body faster than the body can make it, which is the whole cruelty of wind and the whole reason her walls, which stopped the wind, were worth more than a stove. She knew none of these figures as figures lying in her dark. She knew them as the sound of the camp coming apart. For the wind did come apart the camp. It peeled the tar paper off the eastern bunkhouse in long strips. It knocked down 2 stovepipes, and one crew had to put out their own stove and sit in the cold and dark, because the smoke had nowhere to go and began to fill the room, and a room full of smoke is a room you die in as surely as a room full of cold. It drove fine snow up under the raised door sills in fans across the floors. It blew sparks off an ill-capped cookhouse chimney into the wind, and men stood in the gale watching to be sure the sparks did not find the slash piles. The buildings the whole camp had trusted, the sawn and nailed and stove-warmed buildings, were failing all at once, and the girl in the burned stump lay dry in the dark and listened to them fail. Then, under the thunder of the wind, she heard the camp bell. The bell meant a person lost, or a fire, or worse. Minta lay for one heartbeat, with every sensible reason not to move, and then she did the thing careful people are not supposed to do, because careful had a limit, and the bell was past it. She tied the guide cord around her waist, pulled her collar over her face, and went out through the tunnel into the storm. The wind took the breath out of her mouth. She could see nothing. The world was one white roar, but the cord was in her fist, and she followed it out to the marker post, and then worked along the edge of the clearing by feel, toward the sound of the bell, until she nearly fell over them. Mabel was crouched behind a fallen log with Nell shoved down inside her coat, both arms wrapped around the child, her back to the wind. A splinter of flying timber had come off the cookhouse roof, and she had run for the bunkhouse with Nell, and the storm had blinded them halfway across the open yard, and she had gone to ground behind the first thing solid, which was not near enough to anything. She was shaking in long waves. Nell was too quiet. "The stump," Minta shouted into Mabel's ear. "Follow the cord." And Mabel, who had warned her about the wet wood and the sweating walls and the flame that ate the air, Mabel shook her head, even now, because she was a careful woman too, and every fear she had named was still true. "The smoke," she got out. "The roof." No stove, Minta shouted. Two vents, a tested roof. You decide out here or you decide inside, but decide. And she put the cord in Mabel's hand and turned and pulled. And after one terrible second, Mabel came. They fell into the tunnel one after another, and Minta dragged the curtain shut behind them, and the roar of the world cut off, as if a door had closed on it, because a door had. In the sudden dark and quiet, the only sound was three people breathing hard. Opening the door had cost her. The glass, when she struck a match to read it, had fallen into the upper 20s. But she got Nell up onto the raised bed between herself and her mother, wrapped the child in the dry blanket and the burlap over it, and the three of them lay pressed together in the small space. And slowly, breath by breath, body by body, the little chamber gave the heat back. In an hour, the glass climbed toward the high 30s and held. No one was cozy. She wanted the record to be honest even inside her own head. They lay fully dressed, wound together under wool and filthy burlap, close as spoons in a drawer. But they were dry. The wind that was taking the camp apart 40 feet away could not reach them. Their water did not freeze. Nell stopped being too quiet and began after a while to complain, which was the best sound Minta had ever heard. And it was Nell, half asleep against her mother, who first said the word that had been thrown at Minta as a joke and now came back to her turned all the way around. "It's warm," the child murmured. "It's like a queen's house." Mabel began to laugh and then to cry, and did both at once with her face in her daughter's hair. The roof spoke to her at what she guessed was the 6th hour. Snow had built on the sheltered side where the wind curled and dropped its load, and a pole under that side began to tick, the small, dry sound of a mouse in a wall, exactly as Lucien had promised. Minta could not ignore it, and did not. She crawled into the tunnel where a small service flap let her work the long pole out along the low edge of the roof, and she pushed the built snow off the overloaded side without ever climbing up into the full teeth of the wind. A cornice of snow broke away and fell, and the pole's ticking eased, and the note when she struck it with the spoon came back clear. Mabel watched her come back in coated with driven snow, and understood something she had not before. "It is not the tree," Mabel said slowly. "It is that you can mend it from the inside. You built yourself a way to keep fixing it in the middle of the night." Minta only nodded and lay back down, because that was exactly the thing, and there was no time to be proud of it. At the 8th hour, the curtain moved, and she thought it was the wind, and it was Warren Pike. He came through the tunnel on his hands and knees and fell across the floor and did not get up. His gloves were gone. His words came out slurred and wrong. Ice sheeted one side of his face. He had been out at the mule line when the lanterns died, every bunkhouse light swallowed in the blowing snow, and he had remembered one light he knew the direction of by, the girl's marker. And he had crawled by dead reckoning until his hand found her guide cord, and he had followed it in. Mabel reached at once to rub his bare hands, hard, the way everyone knew to do, and Minta caught her wrist. "No," Lucian's voice coming out of her mouth. "You do not rub frozen flesh. You do not put it near the flame. You warm it slow, or you do worse than the cold did." They stripped his wet outer coat, and his frozen, gloveless hands went not against fire, but against the warm skin of Minta's own belly and Mabel's, under their clothes, and they wrapped him by degrees. And when he could swallow, they gave him water off the burlap-wrapped jug, warm from their bodies, not hot, warm, not scalding. Slow. 4 people now in a room built for one. 4 bodies threw more heat, but 4 bodies also breathed more and wetted the air more. And Minta felt the walls begin to run and slid the high vent open another notch and watched the warm vapor stream out of it and freeze into a white collar around the cap outside. The vent would choke on its own breath if she let it. She would be clearing it all night. She understood that and accepted it the way you accept a watch you cannot leave. And then, over the storm, a fist began to pound on the tunnel mouth, and a voice she knew and did not love shouted her name. The store's roof had gone. Orson Pyle had crossed the yard with the company ledger buttoned inside his coat and nowhere left to stand, and he was pounding on the door of the shelter he had called a grave, demanding to be let into the thing he had come to split for kindling. Minta lay still. Every reason she had was a good one. He had locked her out 1 hour after her mother's burial. He had taken her wages and called them a debt. He had put his boot through her roof and laughed, and every body she let in cost the air and the food and the fragile heat she was tending for the people already inside. It was Nell who settled it. The child lifted her head and said, simple as only a child can be, he'll die out there. CTA. If you are invested in Minta's decision, subscribe and stay with us, because the shelter is now holding more than twice the number of people it was built to protect. Minta reached up and pulled the curtain aside, and Orson Pyle crawled into the grave he had named and lay down among the living it held. He wanted every candle lit. He was frightened, and frightened men want light, and he demanded it in the shaking voice of a man used to being obeyed. Minta lit one, only one. 5 bodies make more heat than 6 candles, she told him. And a candle left burning while people sleep is how the whole thing kills us instead of the storm. 1, for the light, and it goes out before we rest. He argued, and then he stopped arguing, because the one candle he had forced her to light showed him something worse than the dark. It showed him the underside of the roof canvas, where the breath of 5 people had gathered into fat droplets that had begun to run, to gather and fall, threatening the one dry bed that was keeping them all alive. And he watched the girl he had tried to freeze out get up in the crowded dark, in the worst hour of the storm, and cut a shallow channel in the duff lining with her awl, to lead the dripping water off toward the rubble drain, mending her shelter while she lay inside it full of the people who had mocked her. He did not apologize. Fear does not make a man humble, it only makes him quiet. But he was quiet. The peak came near what she guessed was the 16th hour, and it came as a single great blow. A whole branch, a limb torn from some standing tree, upslope, longer than a man bow, came down out of the black and landed square across the roof. The woven lattice took it and bent. Minta heard the note of the main pole change all at once. Not a ticking now, but a low groan, the sound of wood deciding. In the dark, blind, she did the thing she had built the means to do without ever knowing she would need it. She snatched up the stout removable post she had cut to serve as a table leg and jammed it upright under the groaning pole, footing it on the firm bed frame, and Warren Pike, barely able to speak but able to hold, put his ruined hands around its base and held it down while Mabel dragged the bedding and the children clear of the line where the roof would come if it came. The pole took the post. The branch's weight, which had gathered onto that one groaning span, ran now down the post into the bed frame and out into the thick stump wall. The load spreading to the rim of the cup, 4 sticks answering where one had cried out, the twigs and the tin cup all over again in the dark, with 5 lives on it instead of a finger. The lattice held its bend and settled, and did not break. The groan faded back to a tick, and then to nothing. They lay in the dark and breathed. No one spoke for a long time. There was only the storm outside, tearing at a camp full of good sawn lumber, and inside the burned stump, 5 people alive in a room where the winter, for all its size, could not reach them. Toward what must have been dawn, the wind began, at last, to ease. The whistle at the vent dropped its note. The great blows came farther apart. Minta cleared the vent one more time and checked her glass, and it read 39 degrees near the bed, while somewhere on the far side of 2 feet of stump wall and 18 inches of snow, the true air still stood below zero. She had built a room the winter could not command. She had proven it with 5 lives. And she lay awake in the graying dark, listening to the storm lose its grip, and knew, even in the middle of being right, that being right would not be the end of it, because Orson Pyle was breathing 3 feet away, with his company ledger still buttoned against his chest. And when the sun came up and the wind died, the man who owed her wages and coveted her walls would still own the book that said she was worth nothing at all. The wind died in the last dark before morning, and when the light came gray through the vent, Cyrus Wynne and Lucian Harrow dug their way to the stump through drifts as high as a man's chest and called her name. Wynne expected to be digging out a body. What he got when he pulled the outer curtain back was 5 voices answering him at once out of a warm, dark hole, and a girl's face, hollow-eyed and filthy and alive, telling him to mind the roof brace on his way in. He did not apologize. That would come later, and it would cost him more than a morning to say. But he looked a long time at the clear vents streaming their thin white breath into the frozen air, and at the dry bedding, and at Warren Pike's fingers, which had color in them again, and he said nothing at all, which from Wynne was a kind of shout. By noon the whole camp knew, and the knowing changed everything. Wynne made it official in the way that mattered, which was with his boots. He walked Minta and half the crew through the wreckage on a slow inspection, and he did not soften it. The eastern bunkhouse had lost its roofing in strips. Snow lay in fans across the sleeping platforms, and the blankets were soaked through and frozen stiff. In the cookhouse, the damaged chimney had backed smoke into the room so badly they'd had to let the stove die at the height of the cold. 2 men had frostbitten toes. 1 had lost the tip of an ear. The buildings the company had trusted, the sawn and nailed and stove-fed buildings, had all half failed at once. Then he brought them up the west, cut to the stump, and had Minta open it and let each man crawl in and put his hand on the dry bed and read the thermometer that still hung by the platform, which even hours after the fire of 5 bodies had left it, stood well above freezing while the yard outside sat near zero. Wynne stood in the trampled snow with the crew around him and said the thing that men would repeat in that camp for years. I told this girl her tree would bury her standing up. He let it sit. She built it so that nobody had to stand. He looked at her, and there was no warmth in his face, only the harder thing, respect. You will winter here, and no man touches this stump or moves a pole of it without her word. That is a camp order, and I will fire the man who breaks it. It was not an apology. She understood the difference and did not ask for more. An apology was about his feelings. This was about her walls, and her walls were what she needed. Warren Pike gave her the second thing, and it was worth more than Wynne's order because Warren had nothing to gain by it. He told the crew, flat and grudging, exactly what had happened to him in the storm. That every bunkhouse lantern had gone out in the blowing snow, that he had been as good as dead in the open yard, and that he had lived because the girl's guide cord found his hand, and the girl's hole was warmer than anything the company had built. He did not say she was clever. He said her water was still liquid, and he could move his fingers before dawn. A man reporting facts he dislikes is believed where a friend singing praises is not, and Warren disliked owing anyone. The camp believed him. After that, they came to her, not all at once, and not warmly. A sawyer whose bunk sat under the worst of the leaks stopped her by the woodpile and asked, not quite meeting her eye, how a man might keep the wind off in a building that could not be moved into a tree. Others followed. And here Minta did the thing that mattered most to what she would become, though she could not have said so then. She did not tell them to go live in stumps. She knew there was one such stump in 100 acres, and it was hers. What she gave them instead were the principles underneath it, the bones with the tree stripped off. Warm a small room, not a big one, she told them. Your bunkhouse is a barn. You do not need the whole barn warm, wall off the end where you sleep and let the rest go cold. Stop the drafts, she said, and showed them the candle trick her mother had taught her, the flame laid flat against a seam. Get your bedding up off the floor, because the floor steals heat all night. Guard your stovepipe and your vents against the snow. Put a turn in your doorway so the wind cannot fire straight through. And check your roof loads from underneath from a safe place, listening, not from on top in the wind. The innovation spread the only way it could travel, not as a magic tree, but as a handful of rules a man could carry to any building he owned. She proved it to the doubters the way she proved everything, by making the buildings confess. She walked the length of the ruined eastern bunkhouse one evening with a single candle held low, and the crew followed her, arms crossed, half of them still calling her the queen behind her back. She stopped at the third bunk and held the flame near the wall seam, and it laid flat, streaming sideways, pointing like a finger at the gap where the cold walked in. She moved down the wall. The flame bent at one board joint and stood straight at the next, and the men who slept there for years and had never once been able to say why one bunk froze and another did not, now watched the answer written in a leaning flame. You have been feeding your stove to warm the mountain outside that seam, Minta said. Stop the seam and you have the wood. They patched the worst of the gaps with tar paper and oakum before they ever added a stick to the fire, and the bunkhouse that night was warmer on less wood than it had been all winter, and after that fewer men called her the queen, and those who did began to mean it differently. She did the same for Mabel, who had a harder problem, a 9-year-old girl who kept taking chill in the great drafty cookhouse where the stove warmed the cooking end and left the sleeping end cold as a porch. Minta did not tell Mabel to heat the whole barn of a building. She hung canvas curtains across one corner near the stovepipe, walled off a sleeping alcove no bigger than it needed to be, raised Nell's cot off the floor, and put a turn of curtain at its entrance. A small, warmed room inside a large, cold one. Nell stopped taking chill. Mabel, who had been the first to name every way the stump might kill her, became the first to build a small, warm room of her own and told anyone who would listen that the girl knew what she was about. Orson Pyle watched it spread and hated it. His store roof was ruined. His stump had held the very people he'd meant to profit from, and the girl he had tried to freeze off the mountain was now being asked for advice by his own crew. He could not bear that the story was becoming hers, so he tried to take the ending of it. 5 bodies in a hole, he said, loud, at the ruined store where men could hear. Of course it was warm. Pack 5 people into any box and it warms. That was not her design. That was arithmetic. Any fool could have done the same in a root cellar. Minta was there, hauling salvage. She did not raise her voice. You are right that 5 bodies made heat, she said. The same 5 bodies were in the cookhouse yard when the storm hit, and in the bunkhouse, and they were freezing there. Why did the same bodies freeze 40 feet from my stump and keep warm inside it? Pyle opened his mouth. He was a man who always had a next thing to say, and for once, he did not. The men waited on it, and it did not come, and his silence answered louder than anything Minta could have said. He turned back to his salvage, but he still held the ledger, and at the bottom of his silence was not shame but calculation, and she saw it, and she was not fooled into thinking she had won anything but an afternoon. She and Lucian rebuilt the roof properly once the storm had passed, and in the rebuilding, the last of the distance between teacher and student wore away. They replaced the temporary rawhide lashings with iron straps hammered flat from old barrel hoops so the joints would not depend on hide that could rot. It was slow work, and it was the first time she had seen Lucien build rather than teach, and she learned as much from watching his hands, the good one and the ruined one working together in an old practiced partnership, as from anything he said. He heated the hoop iron in Mabel's cook stove, let her beat it flat on a flat stone while he held it with tongs in his bad hand, and showed her how to punch the nail holes while the iron was still soft rather than fighting cold metal. Every strap she set that day, she set the way he would have, and he told her so, and it was worth more than praise because it was only true. He showed her how to run a taut cord from a peg on the roof to a mark on the wall. An inspection line, he called it, a plumb of sorts, so that a single glance would tell her whether any part of the roof had sagged since she last looked. They cut a second vent, capped and protected so that no single blockage could ever choke the whole chamber. They extended the rubble drain further downhill, and Lucienne made her cut a removable panel in the inner wall so she could clear the high vent from inside without ever opening the entrance to the storm, the lesson of the crisis built into the wood. Last, he had her whitewash the upper third of the chamber with a lime slurry. She thought it was foolishness, a bit of parlor pride in a burned stump. "It is not for looks," he said. "White shows you black. Soot from a bad burning candle shows on white before your lungs feel it. Wet shows on white before your blankets drink it. You have built yourself a shelter that will try to hide its own troubles from you in the dark. The whitewash makes it confess." She understood then that he did not teach her things. He taught her how the thing would try to kill her and left her to build against it. His backstory came out in pieces over those working days, never as a speech. He had built flumes for the water companies when he was young, the long wooden troughs that carried water and sometimes logs for miles along the mountainsides. And there was no schooling in the world that taught a man more about how water runs and how a long span carries than building a thing that had to hold tons of moving water 100 feet in the air. Then the mines, cribbing shafts, holding the mountain up off the men who dug in it. The hand had gone in a mine between a timber and the rock, and after that no one wanted a carpenter who could not grip, and he had drifted up into the logging camps to do the small, careful work no one else had patience for. They clashed once, and it was a good clash, the kind that makes two people more equal. He was walking her through the crisis after the fact, making her account for every place she had deviated from the plan scratched on the pine slab, the drip channel she'd cut in the dark, the post she'd jammed under the groaning pole, the extra knot she'd opened in the vent for the fifth and sixth bodies. He was not praising them. He was interrogating them one after another as departures from the design, and it began to sting. "A plan that cannot be changed," Lucienne said, "is only a picture. And a teacher who will not let his student fail where it is safe to fail," Minta said back, "is only a man reading aloud." She did not know she was going to say it until it was out. "You would not teach me the span at Wynn's table. You made me build the first roof half blind and let Pyle break it so I would learn the load with my own eyes. You have been letting me fail on purpose since the night you climbed this hill. Do not scold me now for changing the plan when the plan met the storm. Changing it in the dark, with 5 lives on it, that is the whole thing you taught me." The old man looked at her a long moment. Then he almost smiled, which for Lucienne was an event on the order of weather. "Yes," he said, "it is." And after that they were not teacher and student any longer. Or not only that. They were two builders who argued with the load and not with each other, and it was the finest thing that had happened to her since her mother died. Spring undid him. The thaw brought flume work, and Lucian could not keep his hands off it, bad hand or no, and on a repair high on a trestle, a length of green timber shifted and drove his ruined left hand against an iron bracket and opened it to the bone. It should have been nothing. In a mountain camp in 1905, it was not nothing. The wound went bad within days, the hand swelling hot and red, the streaks beginning to climb his wrist, and the camp doctor, who was really a horse doctor with a bag, told him plainly that he would keep the hand and maybe the arm only if he got down off the mountain to real doctoring and clean air, and stayed down. He did not argue with the load this time. He knew a losing span when he saw one. On the morning the freight wagon took him down, he did not make a speech. He took his carpenter's square, the same one he had carried up the hill in the dark the night they met, the tool by which he had judged whether she was worth teaching, and he put it in her hands. "You finally argue with the load," he said, "instead of with the person warning you about it." That was all. He climbed onto the wagon and did not look back, because Lucian Harrow did not do things that were only for show, and looking back was only for show. She stood in the wet spring mud and watched the wagon take him down through the cut, past the stumps standing like broken towers, until the trees closed over it. She did not cry, out of long habit, but she went up to the stump that afternoon and sat inside it alone, in the small, dry dark she had built with his hands guiding hers, and hung the carpenter's square on the whitewashed wall where the white would show her if it ever went crooked. The frost was gone from the ground now. Somewhere down the mountain, water she would never see was running through flumes an old man had built before she was born, still holding, still carrying, 100 feet in the air. She had learned every important thing she knew from people who were now underground or gone down the road, and she understood for the first time that this was simply what it was to be taught. You carried the tool, and the hand that gave it to you went on. If this story reminds you that preparation is often more valuable than brute strength, share it with someone who needs to hear it. The following winter tested whether she had learned a tree or learned a truth, and it did not ask her gently. A flume trestle failed in the dead of it, several miles above the camp, and a repair crew of 6 men was caught out there by a storm that came down faster than the messenger who rode ahead of it. They could not get back. The camp got word near dark that 6 men were stranded at the broken trestle with no shelter but the trestle itself, and a night coming on that would kill them by morning. Wind came to Minta. That was the measure of how far the year had turned. The foreman with 27 winners came to the girl of 18 and asked her what could be done, because everyone now knew that keeping people alive in the cold was the thing she understood. She could not haul her stump up the mountain. That was the whole test of it, and she knew it as she pulled her coat on. Lucienne was gone. The one lucky tree was 4 miles behind her. If she had only ever learned a stump, 6 men would die at that trestle. If she had learned the truth underneath the stump, she could build it again out of whatever the mountain gave her. She took what the truth needed and not what the tree had been. She took canvas and rope and 2 axes and men to swing them, and she rode up through the dark to the broken trestle where the 6-stranded men had already built themselves a fire that the wind kept killing and were burning their strength trying to stay warm in the open, which is the way men freeze without knowing they're freezing. She did not build a cabin. There was no time and no tree. She built the truth. The ride up was the worst of it. The messenger led them along the flume road in the dark, with the storm already gathering at their backs, the horses fighting the drifts, and by the time the broken trestle rose out of the snow ahead of them, the wind had teeth. She could see the men's fire from a distance, a poor whipping flame that the wind flattened and near put out with every gust, and she knew before she reached them that the fire was killing them as surely as the cold, because they were standing in the open, feeding it and calling that survival, throwing their warmth into a flame the wind stole the moment it rose. "Off your feet and out of the wind," she called, sliding down off the horse into snow to her thighs. "The fire will not save you. The fire is why you are dying." They did not believe her. A big Sawyer, blue-lipped, said a fire was a fire and told her to build her own if she was so clever. She did not argue with him. She had learned from Lucian that you do not argue with a man about a load. You show him the load. She turned her back on the fire and went to work on the one solid thing the trestle offered. There was a log crib at the trestle base, a squared stack of heavy timbers built to carry the structure's weight, solid on 3 sides and broken only on the 4th. She built against its protected side the way she had built inside the stump, small, low, out of the wind. She set 2 men to laying a floor of cut boughs, thick, to get their bodies up off the frozen ground that would drink a man's heat all night. She stretched canvas over a low frame of poles, no higher than a crouching man, because standing room was only heat thrown up into the dark. She had them bank snow up the outside of it thick, packing it with the flats of the axes, because snow was a blanket and it was the one building material the storm delivered free and without end. She put a turn in the entrance and hung a doubled canvas flap so the wind could not fire straight in at the sleeping men. She cut a vent low and a vent high, and she took the blue-lipped Sawyer who had mocked her and made him the vent man, made him swear on his own life to keep both clear through the night, because a man given a job to protect the others will not lie down and quit. And she strung guide ropes between the burrow and the crib and what was left of the fire, so no man crossing in the dark could be lost 3 feet from the door, the way Warren Pike had once nearly been lost within sight of his own bunkhouse. They crawled in one after another, 6 men and the girl, into a space so low they lay pressed together like cordwood, and someone laughed at the misery of it, and Minta let them laugh, because a man who can laugh is a man whose blood is still moving. It was ugly. It was a snow-banked canvas burrow against a pile of timber, and it would have won no prizes and looked like nothing at all. But when the worst of the wind came through in the black middle of the night, the same kind of wind that had peeled the roofs off good-sawn buildings a year before, 6 men lay in it dry and out of the weather, warming a space no bigger than they needed, and the vent man kept his 2 breaths open, and in the morning the messenger who had ridden ahead, fearing to find 6 frozen corpses, found 6 cold, cramped, foul-tempered, complaining, wholly living men crawling out of a hole in the snow. Not one of them lost so much as a finger. The blue-lipped Sawyer who had told her a fire was a fire came out last, stiff and scowling, and stopped in front of her and could not find the words, and finally just took off his hat, which from a man like that was a speech an hour long. That was the night the story stopped being about a tree. A hollow sequoia was a wonder, and wonders could be dismissed as luck. But a girl who could ride into the dark with canvas and rope and build the same safety against a pile of logs, that was not luck. That was a thing she knew and could carry anywhere, and everyone who heard about the trestle understood the difference. And after the trestle, the direction of things reversed. For a year, Minta had gone to the camp, hat in hand, asking for a night in a feed shed, asking for wages, asking to be left alone with her stump. Now the camp came to her. A teamster wanted to know how to keep the mule barn from freezing its water troughs. A crew boss building a new spur wanted a bunkhouse that would not bleed heat through every seam and asked her to walk the frame before they nailed the boards. Mabel started sending the greenest new hands up the West Cut to be shown how a man keeps himself alive in country that does not care whether he does. Minta was 18 years old, and men twice her age now waited to hear what she thought before they built. She had not asked for it. She had only ever asked to be paid what she was owed and left in peace. But competence has a gravity of its own, and it had begun to pull the whole camp toward the girl in the stump. Mabel understood it. Wynne understood it. And Orson Pyle understood it too. and it frightened him more than the storm ever had, because a girl with one lucky tree could be waited out. But a girl with the truth in her hands and a camp at her door was going to be somebody, and somebody's got paid. So Pyle stopped fighting the walls and started fighting the money. A letter came down from the Sanger office that winter, a ruling he had asked for himself. The stump, it said, remained company property, but had no immediate commercial value. Pyle read that the way a hungry man reads a menu. No commercial value meant no one would object if he wrung a little value out of it. So he climbed the Westcut one gray afternoon and stood at her tunnel mouth, ledger under his arm as always, and informed her that if she meant to keep living on company timber, she would pay rent for the privilege. $2 the month, he said, backdated to the day you crawled in, added naturally to the account your mother left. He smiled, because he had found at last a way to bury her that no boundary line and no foreman could stop. You have made the thing valuable, girl. That was your mistake. A worthless hole nobody wanted, they let you keep. A famous shelter that saved the foreman's crew, that the company will want paid for. You told this whole camp it was a grave, Minta said. You put your boot through the roof of it. Now it is worth renting. It is worth what the book says it is worth, he tapped the ledger, and the book is mine. She looked at the book a long moment. She had learned by then that some loads you carry with your back, and some you carry with paper, and that a man who hides behind a book can be met only with more paper than he has. She met him with paper. She produced her mother's account page, the one Pyle had handed her the day of the burial, and beside it she set the plain fact that she had worked 6 weeks in that laundry and been paid for none of it. She got Mabel to write out and sign what she had seen of the girl's work, morning after morning at the wash kettles. She got Warren Pike, who owed no one anything and said so at every chance, to sign that he had watched the mother and daughter both at the washing through 2 summers. And she got Cyrus Wynne, who did not like her, who had only ever given her respect and never 1 ounce of affection, to put his name to a statement that the wages were owed and the debt inflated. A foreman's signature was not nothing. A foreman's signature was a thing the Sanger office read twice. Pyle read the signatures and went white, and then he did the thing that told everyone exactly what he was afraid of. He threatened to dismiss any worker who had signed. He would put Mabel and Nell out in the cold. He would turn Warren off the mule line. He would break anyone who stood with the girl, and he named them one by one so they would know he meant it. And Cyrus Wynne, who ran the crews and not the ledger, looked at the timekeeper across the ruined yard and said, slow and flat, that a foreman decided who swung a saw in this camp, not a store clerk with a grudge, and that if Pyle wanted to test which of the 2 of them the Sanger office would rather keep through a cutting season, he was welcome to sit down and write the letter, and Wynne would carry it to the wagon himself. The camp held its breath. The fight had left the weather entirely now and moved on to ground Minta had never chosen and could not fully see, the ground of ledgers and offices and men in Fresno she would never meet. She had beaten the storm with 6 poles and a rule. She did not yet know how to beat a man who kept the only book that said what she was worth. Then, in the last week of that winter, a stranger came up the mountain on the freight wagon, a spare, precise man in a town coat with spectacles and a leather case, who introduced himself to no one on the road and asked only for the timekeeper's office and the store's books going back 3 years. He was an auditor sent from the Sanger office. Somewhere in the tangle of Pyle's letters demanding rulings and Wynne's letters answering them, someone in Fresno had decided that a camp generating this much correspondence over a burned stump and a laundress's wages was a camp whose books deserved a second pair of eyes. And under his arm, when he climbed down from the wagon into the trampled snow of the yard, he carried the original company ledgers, Pyle's ledgers, in Pyle's own hand, the books the timekeeper had written in before he ever handed a grieving girl a page and told her she had inherited nothing but a debt. Minta watched him cross to the store from the mouth of her tunnel, 400 feet away, and understood that the fight had passed entirely out of her hands and into his. She had built against the storm and won. She had built against the boundary and won. But whatever was written in those books had been written a year before she knew to fight it, and there was nothing left to do now but wait to learn what a man in spectacles found when he opened them. The auditor took 4 days with the books, and he did not say a word to anyone while he did it. He sat in the store with a lamp and Pyle's own ledgers open before him, and he ran his pen down the columns while the camp went on around him, pretending not to watch. On the 4th day, he sent for Minta and for Wynne and for Pyle all together, and laid the whole thing bare on the counter where the men could see. There were 2 sets of figures. One was the store account, the account Pyle had shown Minta the day of the burial: coffee, soap, coffin, muslin, all of it stacked against her mother's name until there was nothing left and a debt piled on top. The other was a payroll book, the company's own, in which the laundry work had been entered week by week. And there, playing in Pyle's hand, was the thing he had bet no one would ever open the second book to find. Her mother's wages were listed, and below them, in a separate line, wages for a girl assistant. For Minta herself, 6 weeks of it, the work Pyle had sworn to her face had no entry under her name. He had done a simple, greedy thing. When the mother died, he had taken both the mother's wages and the girl's and applied them to the store account, wiping them out. Then he had entered the burial cost against the account, not once, but twice. He had turned 2 living wages and 1 dead woman into a debt, and pocketed the difference, and handed the grieving daughter a page that made it all look like arithmetic. The auditor did not call it cruelty. He called it what the company cared about, which was a discrepancy. Double charges and misapplied wages were errors on the company's own books, and errors on the books were the one thing an audit existed to punish. He dismissed Orson Pyle from the timekeeper's position that afternoon and directed that Minta Dacey be paid the balance owed to her and her mother both. Pyle tried once to talk his way out of it. He said the second book was an error, that the girl assistant line was a clerk's mistake, that anyone could see the accounts were complicated. The auditor did not argue. He simply turned the payroll book so the whole counter could see it and set 1 finger on the line and said, in the flat voice of a man who spent his life among numbers, that the hand that had written the girl's wages into the payroll and the hand that had sworn to the girl there were no such wages were the same hand, and that this was not a complication. It was a signature. Pyle stopped talking then. He had built his whole cruelty on the certainty that no one would ever lay the 2 books side by side, and now they lay side by side on the counter, and there was nothing complicated about them at all. She wanted the record honest even in her own heart, so she did not pretend the company had grown kind. It had not. No one in Fresno had wept for a laundress. The company acted because Pyle's crooked books threatened its own accounting, and a firm that could not trust its own timekeeper's figures could not trust anything, so it cut him loose the way a man cuts a frayed line before it fouls the whole rig. The justice was real. The mercy was only bookkeeping. Minta took the money, which came to a little over $40, more cash than she had held in her life, and she understood that it had come to her not because she was owed it, though she was, but because keeping it from her had finally cost the company more than paying it. She held the coins a long moment. Then she folded her mother's corrected payroll page, the true one, the one that had her own name on it in the company's hand, and put it away as carefully as she had once folded the false one. Both pages now, the lie and the truth of the same weeks. She would keep them side by side for the rest of her life. Pyle came to the stump before he left the mountain, and it did not go the way either of them expected. It was a moderate snow, the soft kind that falls straight in still air, nothing like the storm that had made her. He came up the west, cut with his coat buttoned and his ledger gone. Someone else kept the book now, and he stopped at the tunnel mouth where a year before he had pounded and begged to be let in. Minta was inside, mending the outer door latch, the very latch Pyle himself had wrenched loose the night he had crawled in out of the storm. He expected her to send him away, or worse, to make him stand in the snow and listen while she named everything he had done. He had earned it, and he knew he had earned it, and a man braced for a beating stands a certain way. She did not do any of that. She said, "There is coffee on. It is not good coffee." And she poured him a cup from the pot she kept warm on the small brazier and passed it out through the tunnel. And while he stood there holding it, not knowing what to do with his own hands, she said, "You broke this latch the night you came in. My hands are full of the roof brace. Mend it before you go, and we will call the coffee square." It was the shrewdest thing she ever did to him, and she did not do it to be shrewd. She did it because she had learned from Lucian that you do not argue with a man. You hand him a load and let him feel it. Pyle set down the coffee and knelt at the latch he had broken and worked at it in silence with his cold town soft hands, a store clerk fixing a door on a hollow tree, and it took him a long while because he was not a builder and never had been. When it was done, he stood and looked at the mended latch, and then, for the first time, at the inside of the shelter, the whitewashed chamber, the dry raised bed, the two clear vents, the carpenter's square hanging on the wall, the place he had called a grave and tried to split for souvenirs, the place that had kept him alive. He did not apologize. She had stopped expecting apologies from men. He picked up the cold coffee and drank it off, and he said only 4 words before he went down the mountain and out of her life. "It was warmer," Pyle said, "than the store." Then he walked down through the cut, and she let him go, and that grudging, exact little sentence was worth more than any grand confession, because it was true, and because it cost him everything to say it, and because it was the nearest thing to right that a man like Orson Pyle had left in him. With the wages in hand and the debt erased, Minta stopped being a girl surviving and became a woman building. She did not go it alone, and here the story turns on a partnership no one had predicted. Mabel Firth, the practical skeptic, the woman who had named every way the stump might kill her and then crawled into it with her daughter and been kept alive, became Minta's partner in the fullest sense. Mabel could not build a roof, but Mabel could cook for 40 men, keep a set of books that balanced, and manage stores and credit and the endless small business of a camp, all the things Minta had no patience for. And Minta could keep people warm and dry and alive through weather that killed, which was the one thing Mabel could not do. Between them, they had the whole of it. It was not a marriage, and it was not a rescue. It was 2 women who had each been proven right about something the other doubted, deciding to pool what they were good at, and it lasted longer and served them better than most marriages either of them had seen. They built, that first flush year, a proper structure near the camp, a real timber building, sawn and nailed, nothing hollow or lucky about it. But it was a building shaped by everything the stump had taught. At its heart was a compact heated room, small on purpose, where a stove could keep the temperature up without eating a fortune in wood. The entrance was a double-doored vestibule with a turn built into it, so the wind never fired straight into the warm room. There were raised racks for drying wet clothes, because Minta knew better than anyone what wet wool did to a working body. Guide ropes ran between the outbuildings for use in blowing snow, and off to one side, patterned exactly on the stump's small volume, was a separate storm room, low, thick-walled, 2-vented, for the nights when the weather came down like the end of the world and even a good building was not enough. It was a winter lodging and a laundry, and it took in the men the bunkhouses could not, and washed the crew's clothes the way Minta's mother had, except that now the wages went into a book with Minta's own name at the top of it. The building earned its storm room 3 winters later, on the worst night the camp had seen since the one that made her. The weather came down out of the northwest again, the way it had before, and this time there was no doubt about what to do, and no one who doubted the girl. When the glass began to fall, Minta had the crews in early, over the grumbling of the ones who wanted 1 more hour of wages, and she was proven right by dark. The wind stripped a shed roof and dropped a tree across the flume road, but the lodging held its heat on a quarter of the wood the old bunkhouses had burned, and when 2 teamsters came in, half frozen off a late haul, she put them in the storm room and did the old work. Dry clothes, raised bedding, warm water not hot, the vents kept clear, and by morning they walked out stiff and swearing and alive. Mabel kept the coffee coming and the lamps trimmed and the books straight through all of it. And Nell, 12 years old now, worked the drying racks like a hand who had been doing it her whole life, which she nearly had. It was not a crisis anymore. It was a Tuesday. That was the measure of how far the thing had come, that a night which would once have killed people was now only a hard shift at a business that knew its work. The partnership was not all smooth, and it was better for not being. Minta and Mabel disagreed the way people who trust each other disagree, plainly, and about things that mattered. Their worst fight came the 2nd year, over money. Minta wanted to build the 4th warming shelter on the far north spur, a route so little used that Mabel could not see spending the timber and the days on it. "You are building for a man who has not been born yet," Mabel said over the account book, "and I am feeding 40 who are hungry now." She was not wrong. Minta knew she was not wrong. But Minta had buried her mother because a company weighed a laundress's life against $11.80, and she had crawled into a stump because there had been no room anywhere for a girl who could not pay, and she would not run a business that did the same arithmetic. "I will build it out of my own share," Minta said, "and when it saves someone, we will not argue about the timber again." Mabel looked at her a long moment across the book, and then she wrote the timber into the ledger under the general account, not Minta's, which was Mabel's way of saying she had lost the argument and was glad to have lost it. The shelter went up on the north spur. 2 winters later it kept a lost surveyor alive through a night that would have finished him. They never argued about the timber again. A full day at the lodging in the deep of a working winter ran like a machine built by 2 people who each knew the half the other could not do. Mabel had the stove going and the coffee on before light, and the day's washing sorted by the time the crews stirred. Minta walked the building first thing every morning the way a captain walks a deck. The vents, the roof line, the drying racks, the storm room stocked and ready, because a shelter is only as good as the last time someone checked it, and she had learned that lesson at 6 below zero. Men came in off the cold and hung their wet things on the raised racks, and took their bunks in the small, warm heart of the building, and paid into a book that balanced, and never knew that the reason they were warm on so little wood was a girl who had once counted a candle's worth of heat, as if her life hung on it, because it had. The community that had laughed at the queen of the stump now paid gladly to sleep the way she had taught them to sleep. That was the whole of the transformation, and it was written not in any speech, but in a ledger that finally, after everything, came out in her favor. And along the exposed work routes, the high spurs, the flume roads, the places where men got caught out the way the trestle crew had, she built 4 emergency warming shelters. She did not build them alone, and she did not build them out of stumps, and both of those facts mattered. She built them out of ordinary logs because the truth traveled, and the tree did not. And any man who could swing an axe could raise one where it was needed. And she built them with helpers she trained as she went, because she had learned from Lucian that the point was never to be the only one who knew. The point was to put the knowing into other hands. The morning she laid out the first of them, she took Nell and a young sawyer named Halvor Tveit, a serious boy of 19 who asked good questions, and she made them build it while she mostly watched. She would not let Halvor run the roof poles straight, and made him say why not before she let him fix it. And he did say why. The load runs to the walls, and she knew then the lesson had taken. She made Nell sight the entrance so it turned away from the northwest, and Nell got it right on the first try because Nell had grown up inside the answer. Low walls, banked snow, a floor up off the ground, two vents that could never both be shut, dry matches in a tin, blankets, a clearing rod, and a board by the door with a posted limit of how many bodies it was meant to hold. When it was done, Halvor stood back and looked at the ugly little snow-banked hut he had built with his own hands, and understood that he could now build another anywhere, alone, and that no one would ever have to send for the girl in the stump to do it for him. That was the whole idea, standing there in the snow, breathing. Minta made him do only one thing more before they walked down. She had him crawl inside, alone, and shut the flaps, and light a match near the high vent, and watch which way the flame leaned. He came out grinning like he had discovered fire itself. "It pulls," he said. "It breathes." "It breathes," she agreed, "because you gave it 2 ways too. Never take one of them from it." He never did, and neither did the men he taught after her. Men used those shelters. Over the years, men lived who would have died, and most of them never knew the name of the girl whose 4 rules had shaped the hole that saved them. A crew boss on a far spur built a warming hut for his own men and never once thought of Minta Dacey while he did it, because by then it was simply how you built, the way you dig a privy downhill from a well. That was the truest measure of it. The thing had stopped being hers and become everyone's, and she was glad of it, because a method that needs its inventor is a method that dies with her, and she had watched enough people die. The years went by the way years go in the high country, fast and hard and marked by weather. Nell grew up in the warm corner of the cookhouse and then in the lodging, and learned her letters from her mother's account books, and her weather sense from Minta's eyes on the sky, and became by 15 a young woman who could look at a morning and tell you whether to bring the crews in. She was, in every way that mattered and none that the law would recognize, the child of both women, Mabel's daughter by blood and Minta's by trade. And when she married Halvor Tveit in her 20th year, the wedding was held in the warm heart of the lodging, and the storm room stood empty and ready down the hall, because Minta Dacey did not stop being careful just because it was a happy day. Wynne grew old and stayed on longer than he should have, because a foreman with 27 winters had made it 30 and then 35, and he and Minta reached across the years into something that was not friendship exactly, but was the deep, easy respect of 2 people who had each been right about something the other doubted. He never did apologize for the grave he had promised her. She never asked. It was long past needing saying, and to say it would have made small a thing that had grown large in the not saying. Word came down once, by letter, that Lucian Harrow had died in a town near the coast, in his own bed, with the arm they had saved by getting him off the mountain. An old flume carpenter, gone quiet at last. Minta read the letter in the small, warm heart of the lodging she had built with what his hands had taught hers, and she took the carpenter's square down off the wall and held it a while, the cold, true iron of it, and turned it over once and hung it back straight. Then she went and checked the vents, because that was the only grief he would have thought worth anything, the work continuing, done right. She did not weep. She had loved him the way you love a whetstone, for making you sharper, and you do not weep over a whetstone. You use it until it is worn, and then you keep it anyway. Then the era itself ended, the way it was always going to. The great cutting at Converse Basin ran its course, as such things do, and by the far edge of the decade the biggest trees a man could reach were down, and the camps began to close. The work moved on, or stopped. The bunkhouses emptied and the flumes went dry, and the steam donkeys were hauled off to other basins with taller timber still standing. And Minta Dacey, no longer a homeless girl but a woman with a trade and a partner and money in her own name, went down off the mountain the way nearly everyone did in the end, not driven off it this time, but walking off it on her own terms, which was the only kind of leaving she had ever wanted. She and Mabel moved downslope toward Sanger, where the freight roads met, and there they opened a boarding house and a laundry, a real one, in a real town, with a sign over the door that had both their names on it. It was warm, and it was dry, and it never once had to save anyone from freezing, and that was the whole point of it. Over the account desk, Minta hung Lucien's Carpenter's Square, and under the glass on the desk itself, where she would see it every day she totted up the takings, she kept 2 pages side by side, her mother's account as Orson Pyle had written it, the lie, and her mother's payroll page as the auditor had found it, the truth. She kept them not out of bitterness but out of accuracy, which was the only religion she had ever really held. This is what they said I was worth. This is what I was worth. The method came back to her once, late, and she never forgot it. A young man stopped at the boarding house one autumn evening on his way to work in a basin farther north, and over supper he talked, the way young men do, about the country up there and the winters and how a man kept from freezing. He described, without knowing whose table he sat at, a low shelter his old crew boss had taught him to build against bad nights, dug small, banked with snow, a turn in the door so the wind could not reach the bed, and 2 holes, one low and one high, that a man was told he must never both stop up at once, though the boy admitted he did not rightly know why. Minta asked him, mild, whether he knew why. He did not. So she told him, the cold air is heavy and comes in low. The used air is warm and must climb out high, and a flame and a sleeping man breathe the same air and can starve together in the dark. The young man listened and nodded and thanked her for the good sense, and went on north in the morning, and never learned that the woman who served him breakfast was the reason he had a shelter to build at all. She stood in the doorway and watched him go, and she was not sad. She was as near to content as she ever came. Her name had fallen off the thing entirely, the way a scaffold comes off a finished wall, and the wall still stood. That was what she had wanted, though she had not known to want it at 17. Not to be remembered, to be unnecessary. Every winter for as long as she was able, she rode back up to Converse Basin once before the first heavy snow, alone, to inspect the roof of the old stump. It had long since stopped being anyone's home, but she cleared its vents and struck its main pole with a spoon, and listened to the note, and banked its snow when the snow came, the way you tend a grave, except that it was the opposite of a grave, and always had been, whatever a foreman had once said. The last winter she was strong enough to make the ride, Wynne sent word ahead and asked her to come up before the snow, because there was something he wanted her to see at the stump. She climbed the west cut one more time, an old woman now, in the still gray hour before the first real snow of the season, and Cyrus Wynne was waiting for her at the stump with 3 of the old crew, men gone white themselves, who had once laughed at the Queen and had lived long enough to be ashamed of it. They had done a thing. The outer cover of the stump had been failing for years, and rather than let it go, they had stripped it and rebuilt it. New bark slabs, fresh canvas, the roof made sound again by old hands that remembered exactly how she had taught them to build it. And beside the tunnel mouth, where any traveler could read it, they had nailed a plank, and on the plank, in careful burned letters, was written, "Storm room, keep clear." Below that, a list, plain as a prayer. Clear both vents. Watch the roof for sag. Keep bedding raised. Put out the flame before you sleep. Never block both breaths. There was no myth on that board. Nothing about a magic tree or a candle that made summer in the deep of winter. Only the method. The 4 or 5 rules a girl of 17 had learned under a one-day deadline and had spent a lifetime proving would travel anywhere. That was the legacy, not the wonder, the instructions. We could not let it fall in, Wynne said, standing beside her in the cold with his hat in his old hands. The men would not have it. There are drivers who still stop here in bad weather, you know. Freighters caught between camps. They crawl in and wait it out and go on, and they leave it clean for the next, because the board tells them to. He looked at the plank a moment. You built a thing that keeps working when nobody is minding it. That is more than most men manage who build with their names on the front of it. Minta read the board a long time and did not trust herself to speak at first. She had come up this cut 30 years before with everything she owned folded inside a canvas sheet, a girl no one would house, and she had crawled into a hole a foreman promised would be her grave. Now there was a plank at the door telling strangers how to stay alive inside it, written by the hands of men who had once laughed. She reached out and straightened the board, which did not need straightening because her hands wanted something to do. You spelled breaths right, she said finally, which was the only thing she could get out without her voice going, and Wynne laughed, a dry old bark of a laugh, because he understood exactly what she was not able to say. Then he ducked his old head and went in through the tunnel, and she followed him into the small, dry dark. The two of them who had begun as a foreman, certain of a girl's death, and a girl certain she could prove him wrong, to sit inside the thing that had settled the argument 3 decades before. By the time she died, more people than anyone ever counted had spent a night alive in a shelter built to her method. The 4 warming huts along the work routes, the ones the crew bosses raised on far spurs without ever knowing her name, the storm rooms copied into cabins from Converse Basin down to the valley floor. The number was never written in any book. It spread the way clean water spreads, without a record, into every low place that needed it, and the plainest proof of it was that people stopped calling it hers at all and simply called it how you build for winter. Minta Dacey lived out her life downslope in Sanger, in the boarding house with both names over the door, with Mabel keeping the books beside her and Nell's children underfoot. She grew old the way she had done everything, carefully and without complaint, and she kept Lucian's square straight on the wall and her mother's 2 pages under the glass until the last of her days, and she died in her own warm bed in a house that had never once had to save a soul from the cold because it had been built by someone who knew exactly how the cold got in. 30 years before that quiet death, on a November night when the true air had fallen to 6 below zero and the wind off the northwest had torn the roofs from good sawn buildings, a foreman named Cyrus Wynne had looked at a homeless girl in her burned stump and told her, slow, so it would stay with her, "That stump will bury you standing up." Now that same old foreman sat inside it beside her and reached up and touched the roof brace that had held 5 lives through the worst of it, and said the words again, gentle this time, almost fond. Minta looked around the small chamber where, all those years ago, no one had ever been able to stand fully upright, and understood one last time that this had never been its weakness. It had been the whole of its strength. Wynne set a fresh candle in the niche in the wall. Minta struck the match and lit it, and in the still cold air, the small flame leaned toward the upper vent, slightly, steadily, exactly as it should. The shelter breathing, the way she had built it to breathe, the way it always had. The stump had never made her a queen. It had given her one small room in which the winter could not command her,